So I think today's lab is really fun. Today's lab is the first of two about different fossil groups. And as a geology major, you're first introduced to fossils in historical geology, but typically most programs make you take a whole semester of invertebrate paleontology minimally, depending on the school you're going to. And so you'll be introduced today to some of those groups that you'll learn much more detail about if you go on and take more geology in the future. So some of the terms I'm going to talk about today are kind of funny, but you've learned a lot of them in your pre-lab. So without further ado, let's start talking about these critters. So these are probably things, some of which you've seen before. You maybe not have seen these exact specimens, but nevertheless, you've probably either seen a snail shell like this in your backyard, or a seashell like one of these at a beach, or if you've ever been close to the ocean where there's a pretty reasonable tidal range, you've probably seen barnacles, which are these critters here. And then these larger things that are creatures that are about the size of your thumb, these are called limpets. But all of these organisms collectively are part of a group that is known as gastropods. Gastropod literally translates to stomach, feet. And that's because the organisms within gastropods are ooey and gooey and I guess like the texture of a stomach. Gastropods are a diverse group of mollusks. It includes creatures that you've probably seen, like slugs, snails, which are pretty much just slugs with a shell, barnacles like we see here. And what's important to know about gastropods is that even though this is a coiled shell, that the organism, the gastropod itself, lives in the entire shell. So as that critter gets bigger, it'll build onto its house here by expanding the length of its shell, but it occupies the whole shell. That'll be important when we see another fossil group in another few slides, that it's not segmented, but again, occupies the whole shell. Gastropods are a really diverse group on Earth. They're predominantly predators and scavengers, meaning that so they'll eat other critters, and some of them like eating dead critters. There are two primary groups that we're going to learn about in lab this week. There are coiled gastropods, which means kind of curved, like you see here. And then there are what are called limpets. And we're going to ignore the barnacles here. Limpets are these creatures. So you'll see a bunch of samples and you'll have to identify them as coiled gastropods or limpet gastropods. So an organism that does not live in its full coiled shell is this critter. And so this is the only living version of this particular fossil group, but they used to be much, much larger, and they used to be in a variety of shapes. And they are called cephalopods. And cephalopod means like head foot. And I actually have no idea why. But this is a type of cephalopod called a chambered nautilus. And it's the only living version of cephalopods alive today. Cephalopods are nectic or nectobenthic carnivores. So nectic means that they're capable of free swimming. Nectobenthic means that they are capable of free swimming, but often rest on the bottom. And that's what benthic means, is bottom. So cephalopods are really cool. They have these calcareous, meaning they're composed of calcite, CaCO3. They have these calcareous chambered shells, and they have an inner and an outer shell, and they don't live in their whole conch. They actually they'll build a little divider called a septa, and that septa cuts their body off from the rest of the shell. They only use that for moving up and down in the water column. It's really cool. So here is, if we were to take one of those chambered nautilus and we were to cut it in half, it would produce this sort of really cool fractal pattern. So this particular nautilus, when it died, was just living from, this is the septa here, was just living from the septa and in the outermost part of its shell. So as the cephalopod grows bigger, it grows sort of a new room, and then it puts a new wall up. And you might notice that there's this, and then the organism itself lives in the very last chamber. So you probably notice that there is this little tube that goes through all the septa, and that is called a siphuncle, which is a great word. Siphuncle is a part of the cephalopod that allows it to move up and down in the water column. So the shell itself is called a conch or a conch. And when the cephalopod wanted to move up in the water column, it would suck some water, or some air, sorry, out of the water, and it would float upwards. And when it wants to move down, then it sucks some water into the conch, and it'll float down. So it can control its vertical motion within the water column. And what's really fun is that, so today there's not really very exciting patterns that are formed by this anymore, but so where the septa here, the septa connects the outer shell, which is here, to the inner shell, which is there. And so currently there's not really exciting patterns that are created when the septa intersects with the shell, but that wasn't always the case. So here are a series of cephalopods, and here's the nautilus, and so here's the one that's alive today. So this line right here represents where the septa intersects with the shell. And today septa are relatively straight, but in the past there have been other groups of cephalopods that are now extinct. So one of them is called the goniotites, and you can see that has this fun little jag in its septa pattern. There's the ceratites, which almost made like a little EKG pattern. And then there's the ammonites, which went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous when dinosaurs went extinct. And it forms this really cool, almost dendritic tree-like pattern where its septa, which had to be incredibly delicate, intersected with its outer shell. So the pattern that is created by the septa are called suture patterns. And again, they can be used to identify which group of cephalopod an organism belongs to. So there are cephalopods that are shaped in this sort of coiled feature like you see here, and those are called, not surprisingly, coiled conch cephalopods. And then there were cephalopods that are straight-shelled, and so here's a really large recreation of one. So these coiled conch cephalopods in diameter can be like a few feet in diameter, or they can be like the size of a quarter. So they can vary in size tremendously depending on the age of the organism. These are straight-shelled conch cephalopods, and these could grow in the Cretaceous when the ocean was especially warm, and predators were also incredibly large, to be 20 to 30 feet in length. They were scary, and they, again, they are extinct. All right, so this might look familiar to you as well. These are different groups of coral, which the scientific name for coral is Anthozoa. And they are from the phylum called Cnidaria. The C is silent here. Cnidaria includes organisms like jellyfish. And that's because within the coral, there is a small, tiny little organism that is not dissimilar from jellyfish. Coral are epibenthic microcarnivores. So epibenthic means that they lived on the top, because that's what epi means, of the bottom. So they lived on the seafloor, the top of the bottom, and microcarnivores because they're incredibly, incredibly small. So when you see a large coral like this one, there are all these tiny little dots here. And inside each one of those dots was a coral polyp. And a coral polyp just kind of grows right on top of their family member, and they grow into these very large colonies sometimes. They can create their own exoskeleton. Typically, the exoskeleton is made of calcite. In silica-rich waters, it'll also be made of silica. And they are typically coral, at least in the modern, and evidence shows that in the ancient Earth history too, were found in warm, shallow water, very close to sea level, very clear water. If it gets too hot, coral do some crazy thing where they bleach and they kick out the microorganisms that live within them that give them their color, and then they'll turn white. If it gets too cold, coral stop growing. So there are two types of groups of coral. There are what are called colonial coral, where coral live in a large community like you see here. And then there are solitary coral. These are often called horn corals because they kind of look like horns. Horn corals used to secrete one tiny little layer every day, and they were used to determine that the length of the day used to be much shorter 300 million years ago. We'll talk about that more when we get into the Paleozoic. But yeah, so there are colonial anthozoa, where they live in groups, and then there are solitary anthozoa, where they live by themselves. And these grow, again, along the seafloor. All the fun little bends that you see here were created when a coral would grow and then fall over, and so then it would continue to grow upright, almost like a plant would, like a young sort of stem of a plant. And it would continue to correct, and they typically end up having like a pretty significant bend at some point in their exoskeleton structure. Organisms that look a lot like coral but actually have little holes that are even smaller than coral are called bryozoans. Bryozoans are more commonly known as sea fans, and there's a couple different types of bryozoans. They are very minute or very small. They live together in colonies, and like coral, they lived as epibenthic feeders. They weren't carnivores, though. They were suspension. They're still alive. They're suspension feeders. And so as water flows through the bryozoan, they will just filter out food that is suspended or just carried in the water. Bryozoans can encrust on other organisms. Sometimes you'll see them growing on the shell of a clam. They can be fan-like, like you see here. They can be twig-shaped, like you see here. And you'll see more in lab too. These are called fenestrate bryozoan. Fenestrate means window. So the French word for window is fenêtre. So this kind of looks like the screen of a window. I'll show you some pictures. These are like very large fan-like features. This is a type of fenestrate bryozoan that very often just this stem of it, Archimedes, gets preserved, but you can see that there's the stem there. And then you have the fenestrate fans that kind of grow off of the stem. Here are some pictures of branching bryozoa. These are the more twig-like forms. And what you'll always see, though, with bryozoa is these tiny little dots, even smaller than the dots that we find on coral. And little microorganisms lived in there it took food out of suspended water. It took food that was being carried by water. Also, sort of fan-like in shape, are some groups of echinoderms. Echinoderms are also suspension feeders. Some of them are free swimming, so they're nectic, and a lot of them will live on the bottom. Some of them will actually attach to the rocks and along the bottom as well. All echinoderms have a 5-point body symmetry, although they look very different. What you see here are called crinoids. Crinoids are a group of echinoderms that are often sometimes called sea lilies. And what you see here is represented by this diagram here, where you have these very large sort of fronds that come out from a central phalanx, and then there's a very long column, and the crinoid very often will hold on to the bottom. The fronds are pretty delicate and don't preserve really well, so they're sort of rare in the fossil record, but the columns and the holdfasts are really very sturdy. They're often preserved in the fossil record where they look like a little stack of dimes. Sometimes they're bigger than dimes, and a lot of times they're smaller than dimes as well. So you'll get like a whole crinoid stem here. Sometimes you'll get little individual portions of the crinoid stem. The shape of the crinoid stem can be useful for identification because sometimes they have fun little shapes in the middle like you see here. This one had a couple broken pieces sort of fall down and get cemented on to the side there. So crinoids are really common in Paleozoic rocks. They preserve really well. Another group of echinoderms are called echonoids, and these are pretty common and very, very common in the ocean today. So sea stars had that 5-point symmetry, often called starfish. So they are examples of echonoids. Sea urchins, like here you see, sea urchins very often have spines on them. Those spines typically fall off with some wave action. This is actually the mouth of a sea urchin. It will kind of move its little body over an organism and then eat it. Sand dollars also are echinoids. So again, you see that 5-point symmetry, which is fun. Brachiopods are also really common in Paleozoic rocks, although brachiopods still exist today. Brachiopods are similarly epibenthic suspension feeders, and the way you identify a brachiopod is that if you were to, for the most part, if you were to cut them down the middle, they are symmetrical, and that means bilaterally symmetrical. But if you look at the size of each one of their shells are not the same size. So here is a Devonian brachiopod named Atropa, and if you were to cut Atropa down the center, it'd be symmetrical. But if you looked at this shell or valve as opposed to the other one, you can see that one valve is much larger than the other one. Lots of the rocks around Rochester contain brachiopods, especially this group of brachiopods. So these are called spirifers. Spirifers are kind of egg-shaped like you see the Atropa is. And then this is the most extreme sort of long-hinged spirifer. This is called mucrospirifer, and then you have some that kind of fall in between. One type of brachiopod that has not really evolved in the last 500 million years are called lingulids. Lingulids are brachiopods that similarly, they're bilaterally symmetrical, right? They look like fingernails. They are about the size of your pinky nail. And because whatever the lingulids have done in terms of their evolution, they have figured out how to survive and not go extinct for the last 540 million years or so. They're also they're doing really well, and have done for the last 500 million years. So they really haven't evolved all that much. And if they have, their mutations haven't really taken off. So this is the working body plan for the lingulid, and it works for them. All right, the very last group we're going to talk about today are called bivalves, also sometimes called pelecypods. And these are also very common in today's beaches. You can see them in lakes. You can see them along the ocean. Bivalves are they typically look like this or like this. Bivalves can both live on top of the seafloor and be epibenthic, but they're also capable of burrowing. Some of them are capable of burrowing down into the seafloor, and that means endobenthic. So endo means like within, so this is within the bottom, and they are both suspension feeders and deposit feeders. Deposit feeders means that they sift around through sand deposits and look for food. So what's true about bivalves or pelecypods is that their shells are the same. Like their two shells exactly the same size, but you can't cut them down. They're not symmetrical bilaterally, meaning they're not symmetrical down the middle for the most part. There are two different groups of bivalves. There are endobenthic bivalves, those that live within the bottom, and epibenthic bivalves, those that live on the top of the bottom. So let's start with epibenthic. So if you are a bivalve that just lives on the seafloor, you have two little muscles, and these little muscles here keep your shell closed unless you want to eat. And the line that connects your two little muscle scars here is called the paleo line, and it just connects the two of them. And then your little clam body would fill in this area here. So if you're an organism that you're a bivalve and you live in the sediment, then you're an endobenthic bivalve. And so when you dig your little clam body down into the sediment, you need to be able to stick a little tube up to filter water and suck water, and while you're thinking your happy little clam thoughts. So here's your muscle scar. Here's your muscle scar. And if you look at your paleo line or your paleo line, you'll see that there's a big indent here along the paleo line. It's called the paleo sinus. The paleo sinus, oops, sorry. I was not supposed to show you my Mr. T name. Okay, so the paleo sinus, the length of it, that is the distance that the clam could burrow into the ground, because the length of it is equal to the length of a tube, that when it does dig itself into the ground, it just kind of sticks the little tube up until it hits the seafloor. So these are the endobenthic bivalves, and these are the epibenthic bivalves. And that brings me to the end of our lecture, and there's Mr. T. All right, so if you have questions, let me know. Have fun.